Welcome to another edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto, Willies, your host. Today we're honored to have Dr. Reverend William J. Barber II. He's an American Protestant minister who has spent every effort to ensure that poor and working class Americans realize they are already empowered to create a fair and a just society. He's the president of Repairers of the Breach, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and the architect of Moral Mondays. He is what America needs right now. Reverend Barber, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, and thank you so much. I love the title of your show, Politics Done Right, because, politics is something we have to do. It's not a passive endeavor, and we have to seek to do the right thing. And for me as a minister, right and righteousness, justice and love all go together, in particular how we treat the least of these. So let me thank you for this invitation and for all that you do through this show.
Well, look, it is my pleasure, Dr. Barber. Let me tell you, I met you in D.C. a few years ago when you marched from that whole march from the South right up into D.C. I don't recall what the name of it is right now, but it was a huge march with people walking straight up. Do you remember that?
Yeah, the mass mall. It was called the Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Mass Mall March on Washington People's Assembly and to the polls. And actually, the reports were that there were tens of thousands of people from all over the country, some 40 denominational groups, some 300 other organizations, and 2.5 million people tuned in online because, we're still doing some of the ending parts of work over is still here, but we had to be very careful. We had intended that gathering to be in 2020, and we did online until 2022. And out of that, we launched a massive campaign to mobilize poor and low-wage voters in 12 states, touched about 2.6 million poor and low-wage voters, and the metrics came back to show that those voters had major impact on political progressive victories, throughout the country. And I think if you remember on that day, the first 100 minutes were all people impacted speaking. It wasn't people speaking for people, which is our model in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Reverend Liz Steele Harris is the co-chair, and I constantly emphasize that the greatest, most powerful moral voices are the impacted people themselves who live every day in this country, who face the injustices but still believe that transformation is possible.
That is so powerful. Dr. Barber, as I was doing some research on what we're going to talk about, because I'm really interested in those who are getting the people that have been left out of our economy to actually participate. They have a voice. And I came across something that you wrote right after I think the Supreme Court got rid of any practical version of the affirmative action. It was called, and you wrote it at Yale, it was called A Moral Declaration of America on our shared task of building the nation that's never yet been. That title said it all. The first paragraph you have, you said, one miraculous day, all Americans may rise to the moral mandate of obeying the unforceable natural law that all humans are created equal and that we each have the right to enjoy the earth. But until then, all we have is this American democracy to protect people against oppression, domination, and man-made evil systems that value riches over lives are our laws derived from our Constitution. It's a very long document, but the preamble says it all. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, every now and then we need to go back, as Martin King said, to what we've said on paper and what our democracy is built on. And as Langston Hughes said, America has never been America to me, but I swear this oath that America shall be. And one of the reasons we say that is because there's certain things that we said. Now, when they were written, they didn't apply it to everybody, but we must demand that they be applied today. For instance, it is in our Declaration of Independence that we said that everybody have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have to ask the question, what does that mean in this moment? What is hindering life? So if poverty is the fourth leading cause of death in the most opulent country, wealthiest country in the world, then that is a violation of our declaration, right? We didn't just want independence. We declared a certain kind of independence, that it would be for life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. We go to our Constitution and we say that the whole purpose of government, the establishment of government, is to establish justice. Well, what does that mean? What is established justice in this century? What does it mean not just to pray for justice, believe in justice, but to literally establish it, to make it firm? And so when you look around and you see, for instance, that a congressperson can get elected to office and they get free health care just because they got elected, but then that same congressperson can block Americans from getting health care, that's not established justice. That's established injustice. When we look at the fact that we have less voting rights today than we had August 6, 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed in Section 5, pre-clearance, that said states couldn't just operate on their own. They had to have their laws pre-cleared to make sure they weren't perpetuating racism. To gut the Voting Rights Act, to throw it into the Congress and tell the Congress to fix it. And Democrats nor Republicans have fixed that Voting Rights Act for now 10, 11 years. That's not established justice. That's established injustice. And if you look at each principle, those principles should be laid like a grid on top of our current reality. We say that the goal of our country is to provide for the common defense. Well, we didn't defend essential workers during COVID. We told them they were essential, but then we treated them like they were expendable. We didn't ensure that when they went to work, they had paid family, they had insurance, they had health insurance, they had living wages. We say in our preamble, in our Constitution, we are to promote the general welfare. That is, and by the way, welfare is a constitutional word. We've actually taken that word from our public discussion as though welfare is some evil word, but it's in the Constitution. And it says everybody's welfare. We have 87 million people uninsured or underinsured. If 58 senators can do what they did in 2020 and block 52 million people who make less than a living wage of $15 an hour from receiving that minimum wage. Literally 58 senators said no to 52 million people, while they themselves have gotten all kinds of raises when we've not raised the minimum wage since 2009. That's 15 years. It's at $7.25. There's not a state in this country where poor and somebody making $7.25 can afford a basic two-bedroom apartment. We're not promoting the general welfare. And then lastly, in that article, I wanted to point out in long form that we also say that we believe that establishing justice, providing for the common defense, and promoting the general welfare are essential to domestic tranquility. In other words, we cannot have peace. People can't say, well, let's have peace in the nation. Well, peace must grow out of established justice. It must grow out of a provided general welfare. It must grow out of providing for the common defense. It's not just peace in words. It must be peace in practice, and that peace must be connected to justice.
I mean, you nailed it. I mean, and we know that a lot of the problems that we have today, it's sort of built on the divide and conquer tenet. In other words, we know most Americans want the same thing, but the only way you can get them to keep their eyes off the ball is to have them believe there are differences that really don't exist among them. Is that right?
I call them micro divisions and deflections. And what we need to understand is this is not a Trump creation or a recent creation. You know, you can track it all the way down to the American reality, but let me track it from one place. in 1965, 66, and there's a powerful book that all of your audience ought to read called A Time of Illusion, where an author actually goes in and investigates and unpacks the goal of the so-called Southern strategy. It was right in the height of the peace movement. It was in the height of the women's movement and in the height of the civil rights movement and the youth movement that these Southern Dixiecrats got together. And it was not long after Richard Nixon was going to run for president. And they said to him, we know how to win. And this is how we have to win. We must engage in intentional, positive polarization. We must make sure that these various groups split, that they see each other as adversaries. We must use the anger against the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the peace movement, and turn people against each other. And they said, and we must start in the South and Southwest, from Maryland all the way over to Nevada. And out of that, we can create, they said, a new rising. We must paint the Democratic Party as the, quote, black party, the giveaway party. And we must make sure that the hope that many had of masses of Negro people and poor, low-wage white people coming together and forming a political power block does not happen. Then they said, if we get caught, we'll lie. And they said, and it's probably going to get out of control, and we'll lie and say we didn't do it. But if we engage in this positive polarization, not only can we split the South, we can split the ethnic enclaves of the North. And then we play our game in that division. This was actually a plan, right? So, and if you don't know this, then you think that Trump is somehow just came on the scene, or the MAGA Republicans came on the scene. And by the way, almost entire Republican Party bought into this, and everyone has used it. Nixon used it. Reagan used it. Bush 1 and 2 used it. They've all used it. And too often, moderate Democrats have used it as well and succumbed to it. You remember a minute ago I said that 8 senators voted against 52 million Americans. 8 of those were so-called moderate Democrats.
Right.
You think about that now.
Right.
50 were Republicans. And 50. So this divide and conquer that you just mentioned is a strategy. I love it the way that a scholar out of Emory says. She says what we are seeing today is an iconography of a too often American reality.
Wow.
We cannot act as though what we are seeing is like nuance. It's like it's something that's brand new. Is just one person. If we do our analysis that way, we are missing the entire function of what's going on. Right.
Exactly. You nailed it. Let me ask you something, Reverend Barber, because first of all, I want to qualify something that you said when you mentioned about they attempted to turn the Democratic Party into having many Americans believe it's the Black Party, and above and beyond that somehow it's the welfare party. And interestingly, a lot of the supporters of the right, or let's say in the entire Appalachian Trails, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, all these places that fall within the Appalachian Trails, where a large percentage of the white people in there have a much higher percentage of welfare usage. In fact, there's a video that I was suggesting that people looked at, said 50% of certain areas in West Virginia, the people are on government support. Not that it's a good thing, but the idea is it's amazing how much they vote against their interests. A lot of what you are doing, I noticed for some time now, is bringing all these people together to make them realize, no, we are all in the same boat and we're being played. Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, I spent a lot of time in Appalachia, just like we do in the South. And, my grandfather was from West Virginia. He was a coal miner that worked along other white coal miners in the 1920s in what was called the Blair Mountain Wars, when the miners stood up against the bosses and the government, and they had Molotov cocktails dropped on them from biplanes. So there is this history of fusion movement, even in Appalachia. You know, the song that the Black Lives Matter movement sang a lot, "Which Side Are You On? Which Side Are You On?" actually came from Appalachia. It came from East Kentucky. A white woman there was singing that song as they were trying to arrest her husband, who was a miner who took on the bosses. Let me do a little bit of a reframe on what was just said. And at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, Dr. King stood on the steps of that Alabama State House and said, "The greatest fear of the racist aristocracy in this country is for the masses of Negro people and the masses of poor white people to come together and form a voting bloc that could fundamentally shift the economic architecture." He actually said that. I think that's one of the reasons, he eventually was killed, because 3 years later he was gone, because he was putting this together, right? Now, here we are today. Let me make a couple of corrections that are often repeated, but they're not true today. One is that welfare, actually, as we know it, is a good thing, even what grew out of the New Deal and others, because without it, we had 140 million poor and low wealth people. Without assistance in 2019, without assistance, it would be much worse, right? And the reason why we have to have the assistance is because the systems don't do the things that need to be done for people to exist, like making sure people have a living wage and have health care. But however, let me take one other step. Did you know that the fact of the matter is most poor and low-wage white people do not vote against their own self-interest? When the insurrection happened, immediately some people started saying, "Oh, that's just a bunch of poor, uneducated white people." But when they did the analysis, who made up that crowd, it was mostly middle and upper class white folk and extremists. Because the truth of the matter is, we did an analysis study called "Waking the Sleeping Giant," and this is what we found with the scholars doing the research. Most poor and low-wage folk don't vote, period. They don't vote.
I get it.
One reason they don't vote is, you see what I'm saying? The number one reason they don't vote is because nobody talks to them. The last time I was in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is where Lyndon Baines Johnson launched the war on poverty. It's East Kentucky. We went there and spent 2 or 3 days in the campaign. They told me a presidential candidate had not been back there since then. Nobody talks to them.
Reverend Barber.
Back there don't vote.
Reverend Barber, you just opened my eyes to something that I have to add to my narrative and stop. I mean, first of all, I'd never thought about it that way. Actually, most don't vote against your interests. So wow, that is insightful. Please continue. But I mean, it just kind of rung a bell when you expressed it that way. Go ahead, my friend.
Right. Well, I've written a book called White Poverty: The Lies and Myths that have been told that continue to exacerbate division between the races. It's coming out in June. And it's for this very purpose. I take a sympathetic look at poor, low-wage white people as an African American. I have mixed root, but I'm an African American. And it was startling what I found. I found out that not only have we lied, we told damn lies about what's really going on. And it's used to keep that coalition divided. See, if you can teach people that white people are voting against their own self-interest, then black people say, well, we blame everything on poor white folk. Then you teach poor white folk that black folk are somehow taking things from them, and you create the division. But the metrics, the numbers show us that most poor and low-wage white people, most poor and low-wage people, period, don't vote against their own interests. They don't vote. And the number one reason they don't vote is nobody talks to them. Now, where does that leave us? There are 87 million poor and low-wage eligible voters in this country today. 87 million. Some eligible. Some registered, who actually registered. Of those registered, some 30 million voted, and some 40 million voted. Some 20 plus million did not vote. So people vote, but they're not voting their power. Secondly, what we now know is that there's not a state in this country where poor and low wealth folk make up less than 30% of the electorate.
Wow.
In so-called battleground states, it's over 40%, where the margin of victory was within 3% in a presidential race. Now, lastly, we also now know through our study that there's not a so-called battleground state where if 20% of poor and low-wage voters who have not voted were to vote, they could not control the election and close any margin of gap. And in many places, it's under 5%. Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin are all under 5%, where you may have, for instance, a presidential election decided by 10,000 votes, but poor and low-wage workers that didn't vote equal 1 million voters.
Wow.
In North Carolina, the last time in 2016, it was 900,000 poor and low-wage voters that could have voted that didn't vote, but the margin of victory in president was only 160,000 votes. Now, why is it that people aren't voting? Well, if you look at our debates, the way they're set up in this country, 40+% of the people in this country are poor and low wealth. Over 135 million people today, 52 million people less than living wage, 87 million people uninsured or underinsured. When's the last time you've heard a presidential debate deal with those issues?
Right.
You don't hear it. So people don't hear themselves talk about it. We had 15 presidential debates in 2020. Not one 15 minutes, not one 5 minutes was spent on poverty and low wages. So if somebody turns on the TV, all they hear us talking about is who called who, a name, how many wives somebody has, who's going to put tax cuts for the middle class tax cuts. You see what I'm saying? They never hear. We don't force these candidates to say, if you become president, what are you going to do with living wages? What are you going to do about health care for all? What are you going to do to address the issue of 40-some% of the nation being poor and low wealth? So people turn off. What we're saying, though, to this crowd is if you want to be heard, you've got to make them. If you want to be talked to, you've got to make them hear you. And you've got this power. Poor and low-wage voters now are the sleeping giant. Because so many people are poor and low wealth, we now have this power. Poor and low wealth people, religious and moral leaders, people without a faith who believe in the moral arc of the universe, and allies can actually mobilize. And so on March the 2nd, in 32 states plus the District of Columbia, we are launching the Mass Moral March on state assemblies by poor and low-wage people and their allies. We're launching a effort to mobilize, to touch, and call to action 15 million poor and low-wage voters in those states over 42 weeks, with the understanding that we need a resurrection and not an insurrection. We need to poor and low-wage people must engage. We cannot sit back and say we don't have power. We must engage, and this power must be felt. Lastly, we really don't know in this country what a battleground state is, or what a red state is, or what a blue state is, because so much has been done to depress the voting population from participation. If poor and low-wage voters engage, all of our concepts about what is red and blue and right state and conservative state go out the window.
Think about Mississippi, what it would do, right? Mississippi would no longer be a red state. It's amazing.
Bam.
It's amazing. I mean,
And
perhaps.
you're talking about where now in Mississippi, 60% of Republicans want Medicaid expansion and health care. If you look, however, at the number of poor and low-wage voters in Mississippi that have not engaged, if just somewhere around 25-30% of those would engage, they could change the margin of victory for president and for the Senate and for the governorship. Imagine if a presidential candidate or a senator went to Mississippi and says, if I get elected, my administration is going to raise your wages to a living wage. It's going to ensure everybody here has you have health care. I mean, think about what that would do to change the whole. What if we had presidential debates and these issues were fully discussed? Well, it's not going to happen until these voters show their power in an election and force people to have to talk to them.
Dr. Barber, before I ask you the last question, I want to postulate something here, and you tell me if you agree. I think the reason we don't go there is that both the Republican Party and, let's call it, for lack of a better term, the neoliberal portion of the Democratic Party are pretty much there as the guardian gates of the rich. And in so doing, they, even at the neoliberal democratic side, there's just so far they're willing to go as far as providing the type of economy that we really need.
Well, I will say this. When Jesus preached his first sermon, and declared that he was come to preach good news to the poor, the Patokos, the PTCHOS, and he preached it in the ghetto of Nazareth, it says that day they tried to kill him. The power structure tried to shut it down. When Pope Francis has said in his writings that there's an evil magic, he calls it social magic, that exists in both trickle-down economics and neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. Neither one of them addressed the most fundamental issue of how we live from the bottom, poor and low-wage folk. If you look at it, Dr. King said in the letter from the Birmingham jail that moderates were the worst enemy of the civil rights movement.
Yes, he said that.
From jail, people who are more interested in keeping things in order than doing transformation. And the corporate wing, if you think about it, there was an article that came out when Manchin and Sinema voted against the John Lewis voting bill, and the article said that they got that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce basically called them and said, "Okay, there are two things we don't want you voting for: voting rights and living wages." And the so-called religious right, what we call religious nationalism, there's a book out that talks about shadow money, and it says that basically they are undergirded by the oil barons of this country, and that the whole religious nationalism piece is basically a function of certain aspects of corporate America. And so, yes, you're exactly right. Too many are tied into what they treat corporations like people and people like things. Even the Supreme Court justices, if you look at their records, the ones that got put on by McConnell and Trump and all, the one area that all of them almost 100% vote on and have ruled on from the bench is the expansion of corporate power.
Right.
The expansion of corporate power. You think about the country. We're in a country that gave corporations the right to put unlimited amounts of shadow money into the election, but then roll back voting rights.
Right.
But even with that, my friend, this is what we're saying to poor and low welfare. All of this is true, and all of this has happened. But even with that, we still have this power that has not been fully use, and it's a sleeping giant that has to be waked. If you disagree with all that I just said, then poor and low wage folk are going to have to vote. They're going to have to vote, and they're not just, and their votes can't be for personalities. Their votes have to be demands.
Right.
We're voting and we're demanding, and that's why March we're gathering 42 weeks. Then we're coming to D.C. on June the 15th to launch the summer effort. We're doing all this before the conventions and say, if you want these votes, then you need to talk to these folks. You need to be very clear about where you stand on voting rights, living wages, and what you're going to do in the first 50 days. Not what you have done, but if you get power, what you're going to do in the first 50 days, because people are tired of being played with. And as Fannie Lou Hamer says, when you get sick and tired of being sick and tired, you have to use all the power that you have. And in a democracy, poor and low wage folk and moral leaders and others have to recognize you cannot leave power on the table when you actually have the power to determine electoral outcomes. You just can't do it.
Dr. Barber, I don't remember if it was the Netroots Nation in Arizona or the Netroots Nation in Providence, one of the Netroots Nations. You came out and gave the speech on the third Reconstruction. And I taped that speech that you gave. Hell of a speech. Are we considering this now the extension of the third Reconstruction, what you're working on with the campaign to get these people to engage?
Yes, the third Reconstruction is I believe, the only hope for this democracy. We had two Reconstructions, one in the 1800s and one in the 1960s. Both of them were killed, assassinated, politically undermined. The first one in the 1800s, there was a compromise made to give the South back to the extremists. In 1877, the second Reconstruction in the 1960s was undone by, the assassination of so many, and then the Southern strategy. So we never finished those. We need a third Reconstruction in this country that completes what a democracy should look like fully constructed. And that would mean a democracy where poverty is abolished, where you do not have the ability to say poverty is the fourth leading cause of death. But that's where we are now. We need a third Reconstruction that eradicates that. It should shock everybody to say poverty alone is the fourth leading cause of death in this country, higher than homicide, higher than respiratory disease. A third Reconstruction democracy says, we had Reconstruction that said put in place a minimum wage, but now we need a living minimum wage for everybody, because $7.25 an hour and $2.13 an hour for people that work in the restaurant industry is immoral, ungodly, and unjust. And if you go down the line, a third Reconstruction means a society where everybody has access to basic human rights and basic civil rights. Health care ought to be a human and a civil right. Fully funded public education, a human and a civil right. Women's right to their health, a human right and civil right. Living wages, minimum living wages, human rights and civil rights. The right to clean water, clean environment. This is what a third Reconstruction vision looks like. And the point is to tell people we have the power to build it. We have the power to build it. People sitting in office today are not insurmountable. They are not
infallible.
Without them, you can overcome that. They don't have to be there. We can determine electoral outcomes, and it also means we have to have a movement that both moves in the electoral process and then stays engaged. I said the other day, and I'll close with this, to Senator Schumer. I was talking to him, and I said, Senator, you the chair, we need a hearing right now in the U.S. Senate on passing a living wage of at least $15 to $17 an hour minimum wage which is actually 60 years old. Because, at the March on Washington, they wanted a minimum wage of $2 an hour indexed with inflation, which means it would be about $18 or $19 today if we had done
right.
6 years ago. But anyway, and I said to him, and he said to me, well, I don't know if I have the vote. I said, if the Democratic Party doesn't have the votes in the Senate to pass a living wage, then they need to be replaced, not by Republicans, but they need to be replaced by
progressives. Yes, absolutely.
Who will not say that kind of foolishness. I said, we need the hearing, we need a vote. Whether if the House, if Speaker Johnson won't pass it, force him to have to deal with it, and then go to the polls and say to people, if you elect us in the first 50 days, not the first 100 days, we'll do 3 basic things. We'll restore fully voting rights. We'll pass a living wage for all workers, and we will guarantee health care. If those 3 things, and do you know, lastly, the things that we're pushing, there are about 7 pieces of legislation that if they were pushed and passed, that most Americans agree with in terms of 60-70%, it would pretty much eradicate poverty and low wage in this country. A third Reconstruction says we must get it done, and poor and low wage folk, moral leaders, and other allies, we have power to do it. We are not just people that history can act upon. We are people who can act in history.
Absolutely so, Reverend. Look, when it comes to funding, because that is always an issue, how is this movement funded? I mean, there are a whole lot of rich people that claim that they really want equality and they really want a fair society. But yet it seems like progressive values, or those who are pushing the progressive values most people say that they want, have the hardest time getting funded. What's your solution to that?
Well, one of the things is, we're building out. We have some good friends and some people who give online, and some people who bring resources to the table. I will tell you something. My history has been, when we started Moral Monday, and 15 of us went in the legislature and demanded a change with an extremist governor, and they arrested us. We didn't even have bail money. We just went in because it was the right thing to do. I always believe that if you go with vision, somehow provision will show up. But you can't wait on provision to stand up for what's right. That you go to work. I'm a farm boy. I grew up on the farm. And my grandmother taught me, if you have a field that needs to be chopped, chopping is when you go out and remove the weeds. She said, go out and start doing it. And if you do it, somebody will see you what you're trying to do and come join you. I come from the school of Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune went down to Florida, Daytona, Florida. She said to her husband that the Lord had given her a vision to build a college, a training school for Black students. She found a garbage dump and purchased it and started moving the garbage. And people said, are you crazy? She said, no, I'm not crazy. They said, you're never going to make that into a garbage dump. To a school. She says, I'm going to work and somebody's going to join me. And what happened? Wow. People came alongside her. I give you story after story. Frederick Douglass said the same thing after the Tanner decision, of the Dred Scott decision. He said, this decision, as monstrous as it is, must intensify and embolden our agitation. So when we did the moral revival in 2016, we didn't know how we were going to get to the next city. But what we knew is that there needed to be a moral revival. Right now, can't tell you every piece of resources we're going to need to go. But what I do know is we have to stand up. We have to rise up. And I'm a person of faith, and I believe that vision draws provision. Now, on the other side, on the government side, we don't have to raise any taxes to do what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. If folk pay their fair share. if we just took 10% of the current military budget, and by the way, our own military budget, if you cut it in half, would be more money than North Korea, Russia, Iran,
combined,
Iraq, China combined, even if we cut it in half, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if we took 10%, but on the flip side, we don't have to do that. If you pass a living wage, then that's going to, there are metrics that show
it'll increase the economy.
Healthcare, public. Bam, there you go.
But Reverend, you made my day when you said you step out, you go do it, expecting that because what you're doing is, I gave up a whole lot for activist progressive journalism, and I tell you, happier doing the right thing, but sometimes worried that and you made my day when you said that you step out and do it, knowing that ultimately it's going to be there. The necessary resources will be there. My last question, Doctor, is the one I ask everybody. What should I have asked you that I didn't ask you, or what would you like to close with?
Well, Pacifica, first of all, I want to thank you all because you all have been there. You carried the mass moral march and assembly on Washington, D.C. last year. I hope in June 15th you all will carry it again. I hope that you will push out over and over again March the 2nd. And on all of your online platforms, we have a promo that's about 5 minutes. It's featuring poor and low-wage workers. I would ask you to push that out. And I'm asking that you all will tell people, go to the website, www.poorpeoplescampaign.org, or go to www.breach repairers and click on March the 2nd, wherever you see March the 2nd, find your state and join us. We gather at 10 o'clock. The assembly starts at 11. This is not a march. It's a launch, Launch. We're launching. And let me tell you how powerful we are in very simple terms. This is the last thing. Somebody said, well, how are you going to reach 15 million people? How are you going to touch 15 million people? 15 million poor and low-wage workers. I said, well, you do the math. If you have 30 states and you organize 200 people and you train those 200 people on how to reach people technologically using the old way of walking the turf, social media, then if those 200 people reach 50 people a day, and you do that over 10 weeks, and you have 230 states, that's 6,000 people, you will reach 1.5 million people a week.
Wow.
And
yes.
In 10 weeks, you reach 15 million.
There you
which
go.
Means over 40 weeks, you can reach them 4 times.
Wow.
So the numbers, it's not, some crazy number. It's just, you got to get a remnant of people. Mm-hmm. We're looking for 6,000 people in this nation who will join us. Out of 300 some odd million people, we want 6,000 people, 200 per state, that will be willing to be trained in how to touch people in those states.
Reverend,
and we are together.
We are going to get there, and I guarantee you, Politics Done Right will do its part. Pacifica will do its part. KPFT will do its part. Thank you so kindly, Dr. Reverend Barber, William Barber, American Protestant minister, president of the Repair of the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and of course, the architect of Moral Mondays. Thank you so kindly for having been with Politics Done Right.
Thank you so much. Blessings to you now.
Today, we have the honor once again to have Dr. Manuel Pastor. Dr. Manuel Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He currently directs the Equity Research Institute at USC. Pastor holds an economics PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is the inaugural holder of the Turpingian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change at USC. Welcome to Politics Done Right, Professor.
Siempre un placer estar contigo.
Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí también, hermano. Anyway, look, you. One of the reasons I contacted you is you wrote a piece in Common Dreams, and I imagine you have it syndicated many other places, but that's where I found it. And it was titled Elon Musk Shows Us Why Individuals Can't Save the World. And I made that the topic of one of my shows at KPFT 90.1 FM Houston, because in that article, you nailed it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the article and why you thought at this time it was necessary to write?
Well, I mean, I guess one thing is that Elon Musk is trying to get all that money now from his board, but that wasn't the reason for the article. The reason is that I think that there's a story about Musk and others that's a very individualistic story about swashbuckling, adventuristic capitalists sort of marching through an Ayn Rand novel, inventing new industries, and, being able to essentially capture all the benefits from that and be deserving of that. But I think it's really important to realize that Elon Musk has actually benefited significantly from public largesse. His company, SpaceX, relies on federal contracts for those rockets. And Tesla, for its first 12 years, the only reason it was able to survive was because of air credits having to do with companies that couldn't meet lower emission standards and instead paid Tesla to meet government requirements for them. And the reason why their electric vehicles are selling so well is because there's a public mandate for us to deal with climate. So I think the kind of thing I'm trying to inject into the conversation is to recognize how it is that the public actually helps to craft these markets. And it's individuals like Elon Musk who are not going to save us.
Professor, you said something that I think a lot of people don't understand. There was a false, people look at, rugged individualism and capitalism, and the best product survives and the market dictates what the products are, etc. And what you've just said, I don't think, you kind of just said it in passing that I think people need to understand. Because of government regulation, the companies that make cars that pollute the air could buy credits by having their money invested or passed on to Musk and his Tesla to offset the dirt that they're throwing out. Yeah. People don't get it. In other words, they created a manufactured demand for him to make a huge profit based on the law, correct?
Yes, that's the way that it played out. And I think there's this kind of sense, there's this story that what's going on is that when we look at an economy that's growing, that the reason it's growing is because of these private entrepreneurs. And I do not want to deny the fact that Musk has been brilliant at times. But it's important to realize he got kicked out of his first company, PayPal, for mismanagement and wound up using those funds to get into other adventures. The other private company that he's really bought into, Twitter, he's pretty much run into the ground. So I don't know how brilliant that is compared to the two companies, SpaceX and Tesla, that were created as a result of public policy and public will. And you're right, the way that he made money initially for Tesla was that companies that were producing gas guzzlers said, well, we want to keep producing them, and we cannot meet the emissions standards that the federal government has for us. So instead, what we're going to do is pay for Musk to make electric vehicles, and he won't make a profit on them. But the reason that they're paying for it is because of federal policy. The bigger point is that the story we tell ourselves that the economy is the result of just individual initiative and companies, it's actually a result of public policy and private initiative. This was driven home to me the other day. I was in a meeting, and it was about a bunch of companies that are interested in investing in the green economy space, electric vehicles, electric chargers, everything having to do with the green economy. And what they said, the company owners, was they were celebrating the Inflation Reduction Act, the bill that was put in place by Biden, which is giving us billions and millions of dollars in incentives to go green. They were saying it's really great that the government did that. Now the government should get out. And it's a stark contradiction between saying this government created the market, now we want them to get out of the way. No regulations, no wage standards, no community benefits, because we want to just jump into the market that they created. That's a contradiction. And what we need to do is to stop telling ourselves this story about the swashbuckling entrepreneur, to tell ourselves a more realistic story about how we need to combine public policy, public investments with private initiative and markets to yield an outcome that's beneficial for all of us.
I mean, I don't think I could have said it any better. And the thing about it, however, is that the people that are promoting the message, it's almost like a cabal of all the corporatists that promote that message. And it doesn't matter what type of, it seems like it doesn't matter what type of corporations you're formed, whether it's in the medical industry, the auto industry, the energy industry. They all would like to come to the belief that somehow they're omnipotent and they created the space, when the reality is, from the drug companies to the manufacturers of appendages, etc., they all, most of the times, the genesis of said innovation came from your tax dollar and my tax dollar. You say?
I have an iPhone. I have
That's
an
right.
When you think about the iPhone, what often gets celebrated is the genius of Steve Jobs and Apple. And let's give them some credit. Half of the patents in this iPhone actually come from chips and silicon and things that were created as a result of federal investments in research and development. All the profits go to Apple. What about some of the returns to those of us who made the investments to make this happen? So it's a very simple message about how do we strike a balance. The problem, Egberto, is that what's gone on is that we've been brainwashed in a very particular way to think that it's all private initiative and it's all the market. You know, we wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago. One of the points of the book, which I think is really crucial in this conversation.
Give us the name of your book. Give us the name of your book, please.
The name of the book is Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. And there is a website, solidarityeconomics.org, where you can download for free a copy of the book. That's solidarity with your readers. We also have on that website a comic book version in English and in Spanish. So you can give it to your kids, give it to people who don't read books, etc. But one of the central messages of the book is that we need to stop talking about the economy and always talk about our economy. When we talk about the economy, it makes it sound like a set of rules out there given by God, nature, or the market.
Oh,
We
yes.
simply cannot change them. But it's our economy. We made these rules about what kind of private property we're going to protect, how much we're going to value the environment, what the wage standards are going to be, how many community benefits we expect. When we say our economy, we see all of us in it as creators and as benefactors and as beneficiaries of this economy.
You know, it's amazing. You mentioned your book. I have a couple of them that I did. As I see it, Class Warfare, the only resort to right-wing doom, and How to Make America Utopia, take away the economy from those who rigged it. And one of the essential things is similar to what you're saying, and that is we have a tendency to believe that the economy is divine. The economy has never been divine. It has always been man created. And this time I'm even including gender. It's a man created economy that actually afforded rights to some. And that some is just a very few. And the rest, for all practical purposes, no matter how much you want to think you have, some level of what I always call antiseptic slavery. I mean, as a professor, you'll tell me, Egberto, don't say that. But, I call employment in the current state antiseptic slavery. But my friend, I don't think there are many people out there that are expressing the wordiology that you're putting out there. There are several other professors I try to work with that are clean cut in the way that they express this, and I can't express to you how important that is, especially in these times. But what we have to have, in my humble opinion, is your word, your books, your manuscripts, your speeches has to be platformed in such a manner that it really gets out there as wide as possible. So your thoughts on that, and what recommendations do you have of how the hell do we really get all of this done?
Well, I think if you really want to change, and I'm sure this is the topic of your books, if you particularly given those titles, if you really want to change our current economic arrangements, it's clear that we need power. We need laborers to have more power, workers and unions. We need communities to have more power. We need our planet to be respected and have more power in the conversation. So we strike a better balance. Now, one of the things I think is part of power is, of course, the power of arm wrestling, power of politics. So I think that one of the things that the power of language is important about is, again, when we say our economy instead of the economy, it's a big shift. When we make the point that addressing inequity is actually good for prosperity, it's not just a question of justice, fairness, or being a liberal do-gooder, but you know that the level of over incarceration we've got in the United States is tossing away talent. You know that a broken immigration system, or one that does not let people who want to work in at our borders to fill the jobs in a booming economy, it's actually going to cost us output. You know that underinvestment in the schools where our black and brown youngsters go, particularly low income kids, if we don't invest in those schools, we're shortchanging our productivity for the future. So one of the things that we who are progressives need to be doing is to really think about language and to think about how it is we can make the argument that equity is actually good for prosperity for most of us. And how do we shift the language? For example, there's a big debate about artificial intelligence. And what I like to say is there's nothing artificial or intelligent about it. Really, what artificial intelligence is theft. It's large language models scraping the internet, taking all the knowledge of the commons, and then trying to privatize that to sell it back to you without a return to you for whatever you contributed to that commons. By the way, this is a lot like the moment of the foundation of capitalism in England when the commons, the lands where everybody would graze their sheep, was actually taken over by landlords and turned into their own private land to be able to graze large herds and take that wool from the sheep and feed it into factories building clothing. And that was kind of the beginning of capitalism. We're seeing the emergence of another kind of new capitalism now by enclosing the commons of human knowledge and trying to privatize it for private gain. So we need to have a different language.
Oh my God, that was like manna from heaven, brother. That was like manna from heaven. I am going to close it there. Dr. Manuel Pastor. I think that last statement on AI is the statement that needs to go around the world. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Como un placer. Como siempre.
Muchas gracias, hermano.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.